You've seen it in the movies. A dusty street in a frontier town, two gunslingers facing off at high noon, their hands hovering over their six-shooters. But what if I told you that this iconic image of the American West is almost entirely fiction? The real story of how the American West was won isn't just about cowboys and gunfights. It's a tale of remarkable innovation, cultural collision, and human perseverance that makes the Hollywood version look tame by comparison. What we're about to uncover might shock you, because the truth is far more fascinating than any movie script. Imagine a world where Native American entrepreneurs ran successful businesses alongside white settlers, where Chinese immigrants helped build one of the most ambitious engineering projects in human history, and where women owned saloons and ran entire towns. This wasn't some alternate reality. This was the actual American West. Between 1840 and 1890, the United States underwent one of the most dramatic transformations any nation has ever experienced. The American frontier wasn't just a place, it was an idea that changed the world. But here's the shocking truth. Most of what you think you know about this era is wrong. Did you know that the average cowboy was more likely to die from a bad meal than a bullet? Or that some of the most successful gold rush entrepreneurs never touched a pan or pickaxe? The real Wild West wasn't one with six-shooters, it was one with railroads, treaties, and business deals. In the next few moments, we're going to tear down 150 years of myths and uncover the raw, unvarnished truth about how the American West was really won. We'll expose the Hollywood lies, reveal the forgotten heroes, and show you a version of the Old West that's more incredible than any screenplay. From the brutal reality of frontier justice to the surprising truth about who really won the West, we're about to embark on a journey that will change everything you thought you knew about this pivotal chapter in history. So, saddle up, because the real story of the American West isn't just about how the West was won. It's about how America itself was transformed forever. The myth of the lawless frontier. If you've ever watched a Western, you'd think the frontier was a place where every dispute ended in gunfire, and law enforcement was as rare as rain in the desert. But here's a fact that might surprise you. Many frontier towns had stricter gun laws than modern American cities. Take Dodge City, Kansas, that legendary wickedest town in the West. In 1878, it had a law requiring visitors to check their guns with the marshal upon entering town. Breaking this law could land you a $100 fine. That's equivalent to about $2,500 today. And Dodge City wasn't unique. Tombstone, Deadwood, and countless other frontier towns had similar ordinances. But what about all those famous shootouts? Here's the shocking truth. In Dodge City's most violent year, there were just 5 homicides. Meanwhile, the average frontier town saw only 1.5 murders per year. Compare that to modern statistics, and you'll find that many frontier towns were safer than today's small cities. So, who really maintained order in the West? It wasn't just sheriffs and marshals. Local vigilance committees, groups of citizens working together, were often the first line of defense against crime. These weren't the lynch mobs of Hollywood westerns, but organized community groups that established basic civil order before formal law enforcement arrived. Perhaps most surprising was the role of business in maintaining peace. Railroad companies, saloon owners, and merchants had a vested interest in keeping their towns stable and safe. After all, violence was bad for business. Many hired their own security forces and worked with local law enforcement to prevent crime. The real frontier justice system was far more sophisticated than Hollywood portrays. Most disputes were settled in courts, not in the streets. By 1870, nearly every frontier town had at least a justice of the peace. Legal documents from the era show that property disputes, contract violations, and petty theft were far more common than shootouts and bank robberies. Even the infamous frontier justice was usually more about maintaining order than revenge. When formal law enforcement was distant, communities developed complex systems of conflict resolution that often involved negotiation and arbitration rather than violence. The truth is, the Wild West wasn't so wild after all. It was a place where people quickly learned that cooperation and law were essential for survival and prosperity. The real story isn't about lawlessness, it's about how communities came together to create order from chaos. The real cowboy. cowboys. Forget everything John Wayne taught you about cowboys. The real American cowboy story isn't just about white men with six-shooters. It's a tale of diversity that would shock most Hollywood producers. In fact, historians estimate that 1 in 4 cowboys was black, and a significant percentage were Mexican vaqueros or Native Americans. Consider this: the very word cowboy comes from the Spanish vaquero, and much of what we consider cowboy culture, from lassos to chaps, originated with Mexican ranching traditions. The first cowboys weren't Americans at all, but Mexican herders who had been working the land for generations before the U.S. expansion westward. Black cowboys, despite being erased from most Western films, played a crucial role in frontier history. Men like Nat Love, better known as Deadwood Dick, and Bill Pickett, who invented bulldogging, steer wrestling, were legendary figures in their time. Some estimates suggest that in Texas alone, up to 25% of cowboys were black men who found more freedom and equality on the open range than they could in post-Civil War society. But here's what daily cowboy life really looked like. Imagine waking before dawn, eating a breakfast of beans and coffee, then spending 15 hours in the saddle doing what amounts to glorified sheep herding. The average cowboy earned about $30 per month, equivalent to around $900 today. They weren't gunslingers, they were skilled laborers managing valuable livestock. Their biggest enemies weren't Native Americans or bandits. They were weather, disease, and boredom. Most cowboys never fired their guns except to scare off predators or put down injured animals. Their most valuable tools weren't weapons, but rope, brands, and the skills needed to tend sick cattle. The culture of the real cowboy was far more communal than Hollywood suggests. Cowboys worked in teams, relied on each other for survival, and developed complex social structures on the trail. They sang to cattle not for entertainment but to keep herds calm and prevent stampedes. These songs, called Dogie songs, are the origin of what we now know as country western music. Perhaps most surprisingly, the era of the traditional cowboy was remarkably short, lasting only about 20 years, from the end of the Civil War to the widespread adoption of barbed wire fencing in the mid-1880s. But in that brief time, they created a legacy that would become one of America's most enduring and misunderstood symbols: Native Americans' relations. Hollywood would have you believe that the relationship between settlers and Native Americans was nothing but constant warfare. The truth, it was a complex web of trade, diplomacy, cultural exchange, and yes, sometimes conflict, but not in the way most people think. Here's something rarely mentioned. Many Native American tribes were sophisticated traders who actively shaped the frontier economy. The Comanche, for instance, controlled a vast trading empire that stretched from Mexico to the northern plains. They weren't just warriors, they were shrewd business people who traded horses, buffalo hides, and other goods across thousands of miles of territory. Consider this shocking fact. In the early days of Western expansion, many white settlers actually adopted Native American ways of life rather than the other way around. They learned farming techniques suited to arid lands, adopted Native American medicines, and even joined tribal communities. The term "going native" wasn't just a phrase, it was a genuine phenomenon that worried Eastern authorities. The Plains tribes weren't the primitive societies many assumed them to be. The Lakota, for example, had a complex political system that balanced the powers of civil and military leaders. The Cheyenne had a sophisticated legal code that governed everything from property rights to marriage. These weren't simple hunter-gatherer societies. They were complex civilizations with their own economies, laws, and diplomatic relations. Even more surprising was the role of intermarriage and cultural mixing. Many successful frontier traders and guides were of mixed heritage, serving as cultural bridges between Native and European societies. People like Charles Bent, who married into the Cheyenne tribe, became influential figures in both worlds, helping negotiate peace and trade agreements. But yes, there was conflict, though not always for the reasons people think. Many wars weren't about cultural hatred, but about resources, particularly access to hunting grounds and water sources. The introduction of horses and firearms had transformed Native American societies long before most direct conflicts with American settlers began. By the time of major westward expansion, many tribes had already adapted to use European technology while maintaining their traditional ways of life. The real tragedy wasn't just the military conflicts, it was the breakdown of complex trading networks and diplomatic relationships that had existed for generations. Disease, forced relocations, and the destruction of buffalo herds did more to disrupt Native American life than actual warfare ever did. The Railroad Revolution. Think of the Transcontinental Railroad as the Internet of the 1800s. It wasn't just about transportation, it was a technological revolution that fundamentally changed every aspect of American life. But here's what most documentaries don't tell you. Its construction was one of the most remarkable multicultural achievements in American history. Let's talk about the numbers that will shock you. 15,000 Chinese workers made up nearly 90% of the Central Pacific Railroad's workforce. These workers didn't just provide manual labor, they pioneered innovative engineering techniques. When faced with the solid granite of the Sierra Nevada, it was Chinese workers who mastered the dangerous art of using nitroglycerin explosives, literally carving railroads through mountains. The human cost was staggering. For every mile of track laid through the Sierra Nevada, 4 workers lost their lives. But here's a fact that's often overlooked. Native American tribes were also crucial to the railroad's success. The Pawnee and other tribes served as scouts, suppliers, and laborers, while their knowledge of terrain and weather patterns proved invaluable for plotting routes. But the railroad's impact went far beyond just connecting east and west. It created America's first time zones. Before the railroad, every town set its own time based on the sun. The railroad companies, needing to create reliable schedules, divided the country into 4 time zones in 1883, almost a decade before the government officially adopted them. The railroad also revolutionized American business in ways few people realize. It created the first large-scale corporations, introduced modern management techniques, and even sparked the creation of America's first national brands. Ever wonder why Sears became such a retail giant? It started as a railroad station agent who used the networks to ship watches to other stations. Perhaps most surprisingly, the railroad transformed American agriculture. Suddenly, farmers could ship perishable goods across the country. This led to the creation of refrigerated cars, grain elevators, and futures markets, financial innovations we still use today. The price of shipping a bushel of wheat from Chicago to New York dropped from 42 cents to 7 cents, a change that revolutionized the American food system. Women of the West. Forget the helpless maidens and schoolmarms of Hollywood westerns. The real women of the West were entrepreneurs, property owners, and some of the most successful business people on the frontier. Here's a fact that might surprise you. In Wyoming Territory, women could vote, own property, and serve on juries decades before the 19th Amendment. Let's talk about Madame Moustache, born Eleanor Dumont. She parlayed her skills as a card dealer into owning some of the most successful gambling houses in the West. Or consider Mary Fields, nicknamed Stagecoach Mary, the first African-American woman to work as a mail carrier in the United States. She was known for her reliability and for never missing a delivery, even in the harshest weather conditions. Here's something they don't teach in schools. The Homestead Act of 1862 was one of the first federal laws that explicitly gave women the right to own property in their own names. Single, widowed, and divorced women claimed millions of acres under this law, becoming independent landowners and farmers. In fact, records show that women were often more successful at proving up their claims than men, with lower abandonment rates. The frontier offered unprecedented business opportunities for women. Take Margaret Tobin Brown. You might know her as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Before she became famous for surviving the Titanic, she was a successful mine owner who fought for labor rights and women's suffrage. Or consider Bridget "Biddy" Mason, who went from being enslaved to becoming one of Los Angeles' wealthiest real estate entrepreneurs. Even in traditionally male-dominated professions, women made their mark. Dr. Susan Anderson braved Colorado's harsh winters to treat patients in mining camps, earning the nickname Doc Susie. Women also worked as blacksmiths, ranchers, and yes, even outlaws. Belle Starr and Pearl Hart proved that crime in the West wasn't just a man's game. But perhaps most remarkably, women played a crucial role in frontier justice and politics. In many Western towns, women served as deputies, jail keepers, and even judges long before they could officially vote. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, often dismissed as merely a prohibition movement, actually established many of the first schools and libraries in frontier towns. The Gold Rush reality. When most people think of the gold rush, they imagine prospectors striking it rich by finding massive gold nuggets in streams. Here's the reality. The people who really struck it rich were selling supplies, not mining gold. In fact, Levi Strauss never mined a day in his life, but he became a millionaire selling durable pants to miners. Let's talk shocking statistics. Of the approximately 300,000 people who rushed to California between 1848 and 1855, less than 4% made any significant profit from mining. The average prospector spent about $200 on equipment and supplies, equivalent to roughly $6,000 today, only to make around $10 to $15 per day in gold, barely enough to cover living expenses in the inflated gold rush economy. Here's something rarely discussed: the environmental devastation. Hydraulic mining, where high-pressure water cannons were used to blast away hillsides, moved more earth than the construction of the Panama Canal. This practice destroyed entire ecosystems and caused flooding that impacted California's Central Valley for decades. Some of the environmental damage from the gold rush is still visible today, but the gold rush transformed America in ways few people realize. It led to the creation of modern banking in the West. Wells Fargo wasn't founded to be a bank, but as a transport and security company for gold. The rush also sparked one of America's first major immigration waves, with people coming from as far as China, Chile, and Australia. The most successful gold rush entrepreneurs? They were the middlemen, assayers who evaluated gold quality, merchants who supplied mining camps, and transportation companies. Consider this: a single egg could cost the equivalent of $25 in today's money at the height of the rush. One enterprising woman made a fortune simply by doing laundry for miners. Perhaps most surprisingly, the gold rush created California's first multicultural society. Before the gold was discovered, California's non-native population was around 800. By 1852, it had exploded to over 250,000 people from dozens of countries. This diversity led to both innovation and conflict, ultimately shaping California's unique cultural identity. The real legacy of the gold rush wasn't in the gold itself. It was in how it transformed American society, business, and law. It gave birth to environmental regulations, mining laws, and even influenced how we handle immigration today, how the West was really one. The real conquest of the American West wasn't one with guns and warfare. It was one with paperwork, politics, and something far deadlier than any bullet: disease. Here's a startling fact. Before a single major battle was fought, up to 90% of some Native American populations had been decimated by European diseases like smallpox and measles. But let's talk about the real weapons that won the West: the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railroad Act, and the General Mining Act. These three pieces of legislation did more to transform the frontier than any military campaign. The Homestead Act alone transferred 270 million acres of public land into private hands, nearly 10% of the entire United States. Consider this shocking truth. The most effective tool of Western expansion wasn't the Colt revolver, it was barbed wire. Patented in 1874, this simple innovation changed everything. It made large-scale ranching possible, ended the open range era, and transformed the prairie into farmland. More cowboys lost their jobs to barbed wire than to any other cause. The West wasn't just won by Americans. It was an international effort. British and European investors poured millions into Western railroads and ranches. German and Scandinavian immigrants transformed the Great Plains into America's breadbasket. Chinese laborers built the railroads. Mexican vaqueros established the cattle industry. The real story isn't about conquest, it's about transformation. Here's something rarely discussed: the role of technology and innovation. The mechanical reaper, the steel plow, and the windmill were just as important as any military victory. These innovations made it possible to farm the plains, changing the region from what was once called the Great American Desert into productive agricultural land. But perhaps most surprisingly, the West was won through bureaucracy. Government surveyors, land office agents, and postal workers did more to establish American control than soldiers. The real battle wasn't fought with guns, but with maps, deeds, and mail routes. The establishment of regular mail service did more to connect the West to the rest of America than any military campaign. The truth is, the American West wasn't won in any traditional sense. It was transformed through a complex process of social, economic, and technological change that continues to shape the region today. Conclusion. So, there you have it. The real story of how the West was won isn't the one you've seen in movies. It wasn't won by gunslingers and outlaws, but by entrepreneurs, immigrants, and innovators. The real heroes weren't wearing badges and firing six-shooters. They were wearing work clothes and building America's future. Think about this. While Hollywood glorifies the roughly 20 gunfights at the OK Corral, thousands of Chinese workers were literally moving mountains to build the railroads. While dime novels told tales of lone rangers, women entrepreneurs were building business empires. And while stereotype painted Native Americans as simple warriors, they were actually running sophisticated trading networks that shaped the American economy. The true Wild West was more diverse, more complex, and frankly, more interesting than any Hollywood script. It was a place where a former slave could become a wealthy entrepreneur, where women could own property and vote decades before the 19th Amendment, and where new technologies and innovations changed the world forever. So next time someone tells you about the Wild West, remember, the real story isn't about how the West was won with guns and violence. It's about how America was transformed through determination, innovation, and the contributions of people from every corner of the world. What other hidden stories from history would you like to know about? Hit subscribe and let us know in the comments below.